Hey, Summit Chasers, welcome to another episode of Voices of Impact, the podcast where you learn strategies to amplify your influence, impact, and how to take action towards your own purpose and mission. Today, we are diving into the dynamics of masculine and feminine energy and relationships with Katarina Polonska, a high-performance relationship coach who works with executives and entrepreneurs by unraveling the complexities of human connections. Katarina's approach is not just about finding love, it's about understanding that intricate dance between our subconscious beliefs and the energies that drive us. We explore the vital balance between the masculine and feminine energy within all of us and challenge you to be open-minded to the perception of these two energies. Join me as Katarina shares her mission to spread love and foster understanding, proving the key to successful relationships and personal growth lies in the balance of our energies and the courage to express ourselves fully. Get ready to be inspired. It starts right now. Hi, Katarina. Thank you so much for being here with me today on Voices of Impact. I'm so excited to have you here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, to kick us off, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you've got going on.
Good question. So, I'm a high performance relationship coach and I help executives, entrepreneurs, high achievers, even Hollywood film directors. I've got a couple of those in my client list. I help them become as successful in their relationships, their personal relationships, as they are in their careers. So, really kind of working with people who have their life pretty much well figured out. You know, they have their home, they have their friends, they have their business or their job that they love. They look after their health, but it's their relationships, their love life that just isn't kind of working. It's kind of like the missing link to having that really happy existence. And I help them solve for that in a very structured and scientific and systematic way.
Amazing. And what got you into that?
Yeah, I mean, accident and bad luck, I think. So I was, I mean, first of all, I think there is an element of I've always been really interested in love, right? Like I've always been fascinated by love and like studying love. And for all of my undergrad at university, I did a lot of like literature and just really curious about the experience of love. So I think there has always been that running streak. And then I became a coach when I was 17. So I kind of was
Okay.
into that world of like helping and serving people. But then I veered off and worked in behavioral science and did more kind of organizational psychology and helping companies with their people and their strategies. And it was really through that I kind of organically began to learn more about coaching, see the value of coaching, started getting coaching. I had a lot of my own coaching as well from like personal stuff. And yeah, and then I was working in behavioral science and I was previously engaged to my ex-fiance and kind of the classic archetype of like the customer that I help with. So I had my life figured out. I lived in
Yeah.
Vancouver in Canada. I had a beautiful apartment. I had incredible friends. Like I went to Equinox gym every day and I loved my work. Like I loved my team so much. And everything was great. It just was the relationship wasn't. And I couldn't figure out why. Like I couldn't
Yeah.
figure out why I was doing therapy and I was reading all the Instagram coaches out there and I was like reading all the self-help books and I thought I knew what I was doing. Like I knew my attachment style and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But it still wasn't the right relationship for me. And in the end, I ended up calling that relationship off, calling the engagement off, which was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
Yeah.
And that's what got me going into this deep self-reflective period of my life where I was like, I never want to go through that again. I don't
Yeah.
want to, because we owned a property together, having to sell that was so difficult. And I left the country and moved back to England and Ukraine war was happening at the time. Like my dad lives in Ukraine. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And I
Yeah.
just kind of went deep into my own healing, deep into doing that inner work. And then I met my husband and together we took a sabbatical. I started training to become a coach, started out with executive coaching. And really it was through coaching other executives that I began to realize there's a common theme here. No one's having a good relationship and no one's had a good relationship. Either they're single or they are married and the marriage isn't going well. And so slowly, kind of organically, we began talking more and more about relationships. And then I began to realize that this is a really common theme. And yeah, and then as I worked more on that in that kind of space and got more data points, I guess, of like the different common patterns that they were having, I realized, okay, I can actually help with this. Like I've been through this myself. I figured a lot of this stuff out for myself. My relationship with my husband is so different to what I had before. And that's when I was like, okay, I think I need to start leaning in. I was too
Yeah.
scared. But the coach I had at the time, she was like, you have to lean in. Like
Right.
this is your work. Like you know this really well and you've invested so much time and money into this and pain and heartache. Like go. And so yeah, I ended up a relationship coach.
That's amazing. So you essentially you had to go through the process of suffering in your own relationship and then
Mm,
diving deep, doing that inner work. And then that's so cool that you were like, I understand this now that you've connected with these different executives that are having the similar struggles that you were having. And I think being able to really be in their shoes because you were there, you understood it so deeply, and then you were able to create your own program. That is so cool. What would you say is that recurring theme that you see throughout the relationship struggles?
mm, a really, really good question. It's interesting because this isn't going to be across the board, right? This is only the people
Mm-hmm.
that I work with, the people that come to me and that I kind of, yeah, we end up partnering together. I see a lot of the same core wounds and the same kind of core childhood programming, which is
Mm-hmm.
the same stuff that I have, that my husband has, that anyone who's a high achiever is very likely to have, right? And that those same wounds, the stuff that drives us to be really high performers, really, really successful individuals, is the same stuff that can make us actually struggle and suffer in relationships. And so
Interesting.
it really came from seeing these different themes and being like, I know exactly how to solve for this because I've been doing this for years myself. I can
Mm-hmm.
empathize and I can relate. And I've either done the training or I've done the endless therapy and the endless coaching. And I know the tools and techniques that work. And let's tackle it together. And then it was when I started seeing client results that, yeah, I was like, okay, there's definitely like a kind of like an archetype of
Mm-hmm.
this high achiever who's relentlessly passionate about doing good work. They're ambitious. They have this kind of like low level of anxiety because they're constantly trying to perform. They're constantly trying to do right. They
Mm-hmm.
never feel good enough because their parents never made them feel good enough, and so they keep
Mm-hmm.
trying and trying and trying. And that same energy can often be the very energy that actually makes relationships not work. Does that make sense?
Interesting. Yeah, it does. It does. So how have you been able to help clients work through that? So it's mainly, sorry, it mainly comes down to like an underlying level of anxiety because they believe that what they're doing is never good enough for their partner and how
Partly
they
that.
show up.
Yeah, partly that. It's also like when we don't believe that we are ever good enough, and I'm sure you know this, right, from like your own work, when we have that core wound of I'm not enough or I'm not good
Mm-hmm.
enough or I am flawed or I am bad or I'm defected or I'm broken, any of those kind of
Yeah.
classic like more anxious attachment wounds, they're the wounds that often make us drive and work so hard and be those high performers. They're also the same wounds that mean that we don't believe in our worth, we don't believe in
Yeah.
our capability to have a really healthy nourishing relationship, we don't believe in our ability to rest and to
Mm-hmm.
receive, right? Kind of like what you talked about earlier, that like very masculine energy we talked
Yeah.
about before the podcast started.
Yeah.
And so it's that same kind of internal drive that can be both an incredible gift that we have and also can hold us back from finding healthy, secure love. And so, yeah, it kind of brings me to the other pattern, which is most of the people I work with are either anxious attachment or like fearful avoidant, which is super
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Like, I don't have, that's not true, actually. I have one dismissive avoidant that I work with,
Yeah.
but he's kind of on the cusp, like he's kind of pretty much secure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's super interesting how I'm like, yeah, because it makes sense. If you're anxious and you want to get help, the same way I was mega anxious, you're gonna lean in and you're gonna do that work, right?
Right.
Um, yeah.
That's interesting. It's so interesting that you just said about like the not good enough and all of that. I actually have a tattoo that says enough. And
Nice.
it's kind of a reminder to myself that it's twofold for me. It's I am enough, but also know when enough is enough. Because I
Hmm.
think a lot of times when you have that style of that anxious attachment of feeling like you're not good enough, you don't provide enough value, you'll often put up with far more than you ever should. So being
100%.
able to recognize when enough is enough, but then also acknowledging that you are more than enough as you are and how you show up. So yeah, I
Hmm.
completely resonate with that and like being that overachiever and working really hard to almost prove to yourself that
Of course,
you
yeah.
have the value and how you show up. So yeah, I get that firsthand.
Hmm.
Um, How do you work with your clients to overcome some of that stuff? Because obviously it's so ingrained in how we're raised or our experiences that we've had throughout life. So how do you go about tackling that?
And another really good question. Like, I think this is something that took me so much trial and error to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And what made me really want to become a specialist in this area was, first of all, like, I'll talk about what I did that didn't work. I did tons of CBT. I did tons of talk therapy. Like, my goodness, my therapist, the talk therapist, like, I love him to bits and he's great.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll still see him from time to time, kind of almost as a friend. And
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, when I think that, I was with him for like 8 years, and how much did I really move the needle on the behavioral change that I needed to do in order to change, right? In order to get
Mm-hmm.
like actual different results in my life? Not that much. And then when I did a lot of CBT and I'm trained in like NLP as well, and
Mm-hmm.
I tried all these different kind of modalities that kind of give you that feel, or gave me that feel good factor of like, yeah, I'm making some progress, but actually didn't do any sustainable long term change. And I read all the books and I went to retreats and I just paid for all these different programs. And oh my goodness, like I spent so much money trying to figure it all out.
Yeah.
And then in the end, it really boiled down to working with the subconscious mind. Like that's what it boiled
Okay.
down to, right? So
Yeah.
that's when I discovered, which I kind of knew about already. Like I trained in hypnotherapy when I was 17, but I just didn't really
Mm-hmm.
get the value of it, I think, because I think I was too young
Yeah.
back then. But when I started tapping into working with the subconscious mind, and it was actually RTT, rapid transformational therapy, that got me to remember the power of it. And once I started to see the results of kind of hacking the subconscious mind, and I began to
Mm-hmm.
understand more about how it works and why doing all of these kind of more superficial techniques don't really give you the long lasting change. That's when I was like, okay, I'm onto something here with the
Yeah.
methodologies that I teach my clients. And really, I've broken it down to kind of a 3 phase process. Phase one is all about tapping into the kind of the stuff within your subconscious mind, getting really clear on like what's going on there. So looking at your belief systems, looking at your values, looking at kind of your own blockers, your own mindset, your own blind spots,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding what are the subconscious mind hacking techniques that you can use to begin to kind of clear that out, right? So that you're clearing out all of that junk that you've accumulated in there throughout the years.
Yeah.
And then phase two is all about the behavioral science. So learning like, okay, well, what do you want instead? Now that you've cleared out all of that stuff, what do you want to install instead? Like, who are you at your core now that you're not kind of buried beneath all of that junk? Like, who are you at your core? What's actually going to make you happy? What kind of a life do you even want to live? What kind of a person are you? What do you even need? Right. So, kind of getting clear on that. And then stage three, or phase three rather, is the integrity phase. So, after you've cleared out all of the junk and you've got really clear on who you are at your core, then we go about kind of realigning your life to make it
Mm-hmm.
more in integrity. The idea being that when you are in integrity with who you are and your life is aligned to that, then you begin to be easily and effortlessly fulfilled and happy on a daily basis because you are getting your needs met, because your
Yeah.
life is actually kind of a masterpiece of who you are. And it's from that place that you will get the results that you're seeking, whether it's the relationship, whether it's like making the money or the career, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of the final thing I'll say is like, yes, I work on the relationship space because I'm passionate about people's relationship to themselves and
Mm-hmm.
finding that right partner, which they do through that 3 phase process. But at the end of the day, at the end of it all, most of my clients have results in other areas of their life too,
Right.
right? Of course, like they'll find that partner and they might realize like, okay, I've got money blocks now I need to be solving for. Or it
Mm-hmm.
might be that they actually changed careers. Like I had a client who moved countries. Like there's so many different things that can happen when you start doing
Right.
that in a journey. But it all starts with working with the subconscious mind. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's huge and also so so true when you start tackling those things within your subconscious mind, the world literally opens up for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it you start seeing things that you didn't see before and recognizing it because you're more aware and you're more open to these different ideas maybe that are coming to you or these different
Yeah.
signs that are coming to you. So for people who are listening, what would be a few things, maybe like 3 things that they could do just to start that process of really tapping into that access?
Yeah. One is a nice kind of little hack. Like you want to start finding out what are the core. kind of core beliefs or the core wounds that you have that are holding you
Mm.
back. And you can do that through journaling. You can do that through so many different techniques. I think journaling's probably like the easiest one that you can do in your own time and space. And like a lovely little prompt to start with is just start writing out, thinking about the area of life that you want to look at. Like, I am the type of person who, and then just let yourself free flow, right?
Mm.
So if we think about relationships, it might be like, if I think about relationships, like I'm the type of person who, and then just see whatever comes out, like
Yeah.
self-sabotage is always single, all men always cheat, like whatever comes out,
Yeah.
and you just start seeing what's going on there. They're going to be beliefs that you're going to have to work with. You're going to have to shift them ultimately
Mm-hmm.
because it's going to be saying something about yourself. So that's one thing to do. And then once you've done that, then I like to, again, another simple thing that you can do is you can start to just question them on a rational level, right? So if we can engage bits of evidence and challenge those kind of unhelpful beliefs, we're already engaged in the subconscious mind, because the subconscious mind loves it when we start to bring it evidence, because it thinks through images and feelings. And when you start, racking your mind for evidence, you start digging into those memories and start digging into those kind of ideas. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what are some bits of evidence of why, I don't know, whatever I wrote before, like, of why that's not true, and start kind of disproving whatever you wrote
Mm.
about yourself and get creative with that evidence. That's a really, really powerful technique. And then the third step would be, what would you like to believe instead, right? And then with that new belief, can you start to really kind of make that more automatic for yourself? There are so many
Mm-hmm.
different ways of doing that, a lot of which I do teach in my program, but it's going to boil down to a lot of repetition and then feeling a lot of emotion when you're repeating it. That's going to be the way to instill it. So if you can do those things, then you're already making massive progress
Yep.
to kind of working with your subconscious mind.
That's amazing. So to recap it, it's to identify it and
Mm-hmm.
then disprove it and then name how you would like to be, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I
And it
love
sounds so
that.
simple. It sounds so
Yeah,
simple. And in many ways it is. The problem is a lot of people will hear this and not do it, right?
exactly.
Because the brain doesn't like change.
Yep.
And so it'll start to get defensive and they'll be like, oh, this is too simple, it won't work. And
Mm-hmm.
lots of your own other kind of resistance will come up. Then you might not be accountable because it does require repetition. So
Yep.
inevitably that might be challenging. And also just going deep enough, right? Often we don't take
Yeah.
ourselves as deep as we need to go because,
Mm-hmm.
again, the brain doesn't like change and it's trying to avoid it. So these are
Yeah.
all very normal things, which is why that support is helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's so easy to remain surface level because sometimes it can be scary to really dive in
Mhm.
there and almost admit to yourself and expose yourself in those like deepest things that you don't necessarily want to be true, maybe
Exactly.
that that's how you feel about yourself or think about yourself. But I do think that
Mhm.
there's so much power in that because you're also taking ownership of your future and you're not just allowing the world to happen to you or feel like it's happening against you. You're literally
Mhm.
identifying these things, saying, this is not what I want anymore, and taking the action to be able to start to
Mhm.
shift it. So I really love
Exactly.
that a lot. And I think that if you are listening, take the time to do it, challenge yourself. And
Mhm.
I think another thing that's great with what Katarina says is you don't just have to focus on relationships. You could do this in your business. You could say, in
Mhm.
business, I'm the type of person who, and let that flow. So look at the different
Absolutely.
areas in your life that you're wanting to work and improve upon and ask that same question and then
Mhm.
start to work it from there. That's really cool. I love that.
Yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned before that you also studied gender in behavioral
Mhm.
science, right? I would
Mhm.
love to dive into that and just what are some of the main things that you took away from that?
Oof, so much. That's like such a big question. I mean, I think I know I have dedicated my entire academic career to this, right
Mm,
from like undergrad through to my master's degree. Yeah, I think one of the kind of, when we think about like relationships and the polarity space and masculinity and femininity and blah, 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 whilst on the one hand, so much of that is valid and helpful, I do have a real problem with how oversimplified a lot of it has become, right?
okay.
And how a lot of it's become very much like, well, it's like the kind of the two energies, which every single human being on the planet has a hybrid of both,
Mm-hmm.
We all have a hybrid of masculine and feminine energies, and actually even calling them masculine feminine isn't actually helpful. Like I kind of
Yeah.
talk, joke with my clients. I'm like, it's just like you have energy A and energy B. It doesn't really matter
Okay.
what you want to call it, right? There's like
Yeah.
these different energies. Like one of my favorite teachers, he calls it like consciousness and love. Like there's just two different ways of positioning it, but we all have a blend of both. And the problem that I see a lot of is that we forget in kind of pop culture, we forget that everyone's a hybrid of the
Mm-hmm.
two. We forget that people actually need a balance of the two, and they kind of assume the gender role with the respective energy just because the language isn't advanced enough to have a different term for it,
Got
right?
it.
And so
Right.
then it's like, well, then, the men have to be masculine and the women have to be feminine and like the divine feminine, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, like this is all valid stuff. And at the same time, everyone's got a hybrid of both. So
Mm-hmm.
there is absolutely nothing wrong with a woman having tons of masculine energy as long as she brings it back into balance.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's when we're out of balance, that's when the problems become, right?
Right.
And as long as you are able to move with both energies and kind of lean into each one appropriately, like I'm fully in my masculine for half the day with my business. I'm
Yeah.
building a business here. But then when I'm doing my coaching, I kind of move between feminine and masculine. Like I'm masculine a
Yeah.
lot of the time because I'm holding space. I'm holding that structure and that container, right? And the clients who are often men will be in their feminine, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
just kind of the exchange that we have because they're expressing their emotion, they're going deep, they're kind of
Mm-hmm.
tapping into that depth and they're revealing it to me. And my job is to hold that space and create that safety and to provide for them so that they can actually do that healing work. And then after that, I might go into my feminine a little bit more and they might go into like, it's a constant ebb and
Yeah.
flow and dance, right? And the same thing when you're, or, outside of work, you're kind of moving between the two and it just really depends like what energy do you want to be reining in when,
Yeah.
right? I think a lot of the final thing I'll say on this, I think a lot of the kind of oversimplified polarity stuff is really geared at like attraction
Mm-hmm.
and sex and like chemistry and blah blah blah. But sure, absolutely, if you're a heterosexual person and you want to lean into your respective energy, go nuts. And at the same time, you can't stay there the whole time.
Yeah.
Like you're gonna have to blend into both. I mean, I can talk about this for days, but that's kind of like high level
Yeah,
thoughts.
no, I would love to dive into that more because I think you're right that it's about finding that balance between the two. And um I would also add that I think it's so important, especially let's think about the corporate space maybe.
Mhm.
I think it's so important for both energies to be acknowledged as valuable. Because I think
100%.
a lot of the time, I myself, I was in the corporate space as an executive and I was in my masculine so much when I was at work. I think because I didn't necessarily feel safe to show up in that feminine
Mhm.
or whatever we want to call
Mhm.
it. But I definitely had a completely different way that I would communicate. The way that I
Yeah.
would just behave
Yeah.
was so, so different to when I'm outside of work. And I think it's really important that we as a society do a better job of recognizing the strengths that both hold
Hmm.
and utilizing it better, right? Because I do think a lot of the time when you're in that executive space, typically the women are more in their masculine at times or that
For
other
sure.
energy. And yeah, so dive into that with me because I think
Mm.
that that's a
Yeah, for
whole
sure.
thing.
Yeah. And for that, we can blame patriarchy basically. But like when we when we boil it down, right, the way I always kind of like to express it to clients, it's like there are three things going on here. You've got your biological sex, which is like your anatomy, your organs, whatever body you're born with, which again, there's tons of studies out there to show that there's like five different sexes, if
Mm-hmm.
not more, right? It's actually not like so two-dimensional. So anyhow, so you have your sex, then you have your gender, which is the kind of the role that you perform in
Mm-hmm.
life, which again is actually pretty fluid. Like, sure, I was raised very kind of feminine because I grew up in Eastern Europe and I was in like little dresses and doing ballet. But I had a
Mm-hmm.
very like rugged little tomboy side of me, and I would like lean into that. And so anyhow, so you kind of have your role that you play, and the kind of the gender, and then you have the two energies, and you have like the masculine and the feminine energies. And again, the danger is that we actually call them masculine and feminine. Like if we call them energy A and energy B,
Yeah.
then it would just be like, okay, one of the energies is more about expressing emotion and expressing love and like, going in, like being more fluid and having more of that kind of like this is again where it gets really problematic, but like having more chaos, right?
Uh-huh.
And then you have more of the energy A, which like that's more of the quote unquote masculine stuff, which is more about structure and discipline and logic and
Mm-hmm.
rationality, like left brain, right brain, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
But the problem is because these two types of energy have become so associated with the gender,
Mm-hmm.
right? With like the feminine and the masculine.
Yep.
And because we live in a very male dominated society, the masculine doesn't actually respect a lot of the feminine energies.
Mm.
So if we even think about a lot of the language and the qualities and how we view the qualities of the
Yeah.
feminine, like when is chaos actually celebrated? Like very rarely.
Yeah.
When is like freedom of emotion celebrated? Very rarely, right?
Right.
Like, and it's bizarre because actually here are like half of a person's identity, half of a person's energies that we're just cutting off completely. And
Yeah.
so when we think about corporate, if we could actually recognize that like chaos is where the creation lies,
Mm.
right? So letting yourself kind of lean into that chaos, lean into that creative energy, lean into that like emotional expression, you're actually going to get more innovation,
Yeah.
which then if you have the masculine energy to contain it and actually do something with it, you have a new product. So like
Yeah.
they go hand in hand completely. It's
Absolutely.
just we've kind of demonized like half of these energies because they're associated with the feminine and because
Yeah.
women have only until the past few decades really entered the workforce. And
Right.
so that's a bit of a rant there. But does that all make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I could not agree more with it. I think you're so right that some of those energies, and you're right. I think the problem lies with that we call them masculine and feminine.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they had two completely different names, I think that people's view on them would be completely different.
Totally, right?
And you're right, especially with the emotion. I remember I got on a review with a past boss at a previous company, and um, it was a male, and he had to give me some tough feedback, I think. And I remember apologizing and saying to him like, "Hey, if I get emotional and I start to tear up, like just ignore it."
Mm,
Why do we as women feel the need to do that? Right? Like it should be okay if I feel upset because I
absolutely.
care about the feedback that I'm getting. But it's interesting in those spaces where you feel like you almost have to apologize for something that's
Mhm.
just part of who you are and part of your energy and the
Absolutely.
space that you're in. So
Absolutely.
interesting.
Absolutely. And it's so funny, right? Because there's going to be kind of that pushback of like, but it's inappropriate to.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if we think about the balance, right? Like we know that the masculine energy is all about structure, container,
Mm-hmm.
like being a container, right? Containing things, having that discipline. And we know that the feminine is all about expression. Does it not follow that, yeah, absolutely. If you are crying and leaking tears 24/7 in the workspace, unable to get any work done, just, crying all over the floor, sure, that's probably going to be
It's
inappropriate,
different. Right.
right? But if you're able to contain it within a space and give yourself that freedom for
Mm-hmm.
space, a certain like amount of space in a certain contained, whether it's a discussion, an hour, a meeting, whatever it might be, and then to work with that energy and then rein it in and then
Yeah.
apply yourself elsewhere, that doesn't seem inappropriate to me. That
Right.
seems like that could be very productive actually, because then you're revealing the truth, right? And if you're revealing the truth, then we can actually work with the truth and actually move forward. If you're constantly denying the truth of how you feel, of how you're responding in that moment, because you have to repress it, then we're
Mm-hmm.
not getting honest feedback. And if we're not
Right.
getting honest feedback, you can't actually develop a business very healthily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's so true. So
Hmm.
how do you think the shift happens? If you could go out there and get this message out, what would it be in order to start to shift these beliefs around the two energies that we truly need in order to just be like well-rounded human beings and successful?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I like, as you were asking that, part of me was like, I just wouldn't want to do it. I would
Yeah.
just like not want to do it. But then no, because I spent so much of my career building diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and like doing
Mm-hmm.
organizational change and trying to convince a lot of, white older male CEOs to do behavioral change like this. And I know for me, the thing that I always found most effective was like data. It's really
Mm.
data. Like if I
Yeah.
could find the science and data to show how revealing some element of like bringing some element of the heart and emotion into the workspace in certain points and certain areas actually drives innovation and actually that drives more revenues or more investors invest, whatever it might be, whatever that kind of
Yeah.
outcome is, then yeah, it's going to be through like logic, data, and science and convincing.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, in the current world that
Right.
we're in, right? But
Yeah.
then and then testing that narrative. Like we know, for example, like it's so funny how certain certain countries they don't have like female presidents or whatever, right?
Hmm.
Because it's like, oh, but how can she run a country? And then you're like, well, look at New Zealand, right? There are so many countries that are actually run by women that are actually
Hmm.
peaceful, healthy, high
Yeah.
functioning places with like very happy people. So we need
Right.
more evidence. We need more evidence of this working. But in order to build that evidence, my hypothesis is that you need more science and data to kind of convince with logic and reason and
Yeah.
kind of very masculine approaches, right?
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
And I just immediately, when you said about like women running countries, if you look at the women who have run, well, really, I mean, a handful that have run in the States, and they present in that other energy, that masculine
Mhm.
energy. And it is so interesting. I wish that we were at a different place where those two energies would be acknowledged as
Yeah.
such, and to see the strengths in both of them. Let's
Mhm.
shift back into the relational side of things. I just speaking from my own experience a little bit here, but my previous relationship did not work out because I found myself in my masculine energy almost all of the time. And I didn't really realize that that is what had happened until I left
Mhm.
and felt like a sense of relief. But then also finding my partner now who just allows me to show up in that space. And I don't constantly need to be in charge and kind of running things and moving things on. And the difference that that has had on who I am as a person, like feeling like I've kind of found myself again, and it was so
Mhm.
lost for so long. So, talk to me a little bit about that. Is that something that I feel like I hear, me personally, because I'm not in the space, I feel like I hear about women dealing with that a little bit more
Yeah.
than I do with men? But what's your experience been as a relationship coach?
Yeah. Really, again, really good question. And that's something I can definitely relate to as well. Like, I think when I think back to my previous engagement, it was a very similar dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that he wasn't, working and earning good money, but when it came to kind of like the emotional labor of the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
or even like the financial labor of like figuring out like the mortgage and figuring out
Yeah.
like buying a property and all of these
Yeah.
things, it was really on my head. And that was incredibly draining.
Yeah.
And it, yeah, of course, you end up in your masculine, or I end up in masculine, and then I end up kind of burned out and angry, just
Mm-hmm.
constantly angry.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it can be like context based. Like that's something that even in my current relationship we've had to navigate purely because we're in Spain and my husband can't actually legally work here right now. So
Mm-hmm.
that's had its own challenges. But what's really interesting is that the energy can it's not purely about kind of like the financial or the work,
Right.
right? Which is I think where we often think of it. We think like, oh, the high powered woman and she's working that corporate job and she's making all that money. She must be fully in her masculine and he must be like this kind of feminine man. And it's like,
Right.
no, it's not that black and white. You can absolutely have a very successful female entrepreneur who, yeah, she has her healthy masculine, and the masculine side comes out with her ability to kind of contain and invest with money and like play with money. And at the same time, the work that she is doing is actually full of feminine expression. It's full of that creativity. It's full of like,
Mm-hmm.
it's this kind of like birthing process. Like I honestly feel like my business is my baby and I've
Yeah.
birthed it and my clients are like my
Yeah.
children.
Right. Right.
And there's so much like love and nurturing and
Mm-hmm.
emotion and devotion to them. But then the masculine stuff comes out of my work. So the point is like, it can be very nuanced because even in like my husband, he can't work legally right now. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
really hectic. And I can see
Yeah.
how a lot of unintegrated, unconscious masculine energy would really struggle with that.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, there are so many different ways to provide structure and leadership and
Yeah.
service, right? That you can do that isn't actually about work. I'm kind of rambling here a little bit. I don't know if I answered the question. Other than it's very nuanced, and I think it really
Yeah.
just it depends on the individuals and how balanced they are within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
When they're not balanced, or one of them isn't balanced, it's like attachment theory. Then the other one's going to flip into the opposite,
Yeah.
right? If you're with a man who's actually very in his feminine and doesn't have any of that masculine energy, then of course you're going to lean into your masculine. The
Right.
human, the human's like equilibrium. We're drawn to
Mm-hmm.
balance. If we
Yeah.
don't have balance internally, we're going to find balance externally. So the solution is always going to be create that balance internally.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're probably going to be quite repelled by someone who's like very in one extreme, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think
Hmm.
the only part of that question that I would want to dive into further is do you see do you see it flipped on the other side where the men experience that imbalance? As
Mm.
like I said, I feel like women, you hear it quite often if they leave a relationship that they feel like they were in that masculine
Oh yeah,
energy, but
yeah, yeah,
does
yeah.
it happen on the reverse side too?
Yes, it absolutely does. And actually, that's something I don't have that many clients in it, but I have a couple of male clients right now who are like too in their masculine. And by
Mm,
that, what I mean is that they are with women who are in what I call like the princess archetype,
okay.
and they're very kind of immature in their feminine energy. Like I
Mm-hmm.
think that they're being all like feminine and conscious,
Yeah.
but actually it's manifesting as like they're often either unemployed or don't really have any kind of passion or contribution to the
Mm-hmm.
relationship. Not saying that you have to go out there and be earning a ton of money, but they don't really do anything from what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
of course I'm going to have a bit of a bias view because I mean I'm advocating for my clients here, but there's kind of this like princessy entitled energy of like, well,
Okay.
you're gonna cook, you're gonna make the money, you're gonna provide, you're gonna pay for the holidays, you're gonna pay for things. And that can then, I think a lot of men can end up in that energy where they think, well, this is fine, this is normal, this is me
Right.
being masculine, right?
Right.
I'm gonna pay for all the days, I'm gonna pay for the rent. But then eventually, after a while, because of that imbalance, they're so in their masculine that they're like,
Mm.
well, actually, I can't even express any emotion here. I don't feel taken care of.
Mm.
My needs aren't getting met here. I don't think I even
Yeah.
have any needs. And so then they end up burning out because they're being so far in their own masculine that
Mm-hmm.
resentment begins to kick in, right? And the women are so far into their feminine that they are just like kind of infantilized. Like these women can't actually manage their own finances. They
Yeah.
can't actually take care of themselves.
Mm.
And that's what I mean by this kind of toxicity that can happen,
Yeah.
right? From the polarity stuff, where, yeah, polarity is great. But at the core of it, you have to have two healthily integrated, balanced individuals who are capable of taking care of themselves and of each other.
Yeah.
Then you can start playing with the energies and kind of having fun with it. But you can't just dive into it straight off the bat.
Right. That's so interesting. I was wondering like which direction it was going to go in, but also we hear all day, everywhere, all the time.
Mm,
Toxic masculinity, but we don't ever talk about the other side. I'm
right?
sure that there can be the
Oh,
toxic
yeah.
feminine as well.
Mhm.
So talk to me a little bit about that because as you were speaking, I was like, I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about what would be considered
Yeah.
toxic femininity. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. And there's tons of it. I went to a girls'
Mm,
school. I went to a girls' school, and obviously I
yeah.
studied into my whole life. And like, I mean, I was the toxic feminine. If I look back at how I was when I was like 21 and
Mm-hmm.
how I behaved, and then all the free drinks I got at the club and how I kind
Mm,
of viewed the masculine, right? Honestly, like I wasn't very nice, I think. And
yeah.
I understand a lot of it was kind of context based and I was, a certain age and blah, blah, blah. But I still see a lot of it in women in their 30s. It's kind of like, oh, well, men aren't that intelligent, really. Like they're pretty stupid, right? Like, of course he's going to pay for it, and like, or if he cheats on me, he's just going to buy me some jewelry or whatever. He's not going to know, and it's just kind of like this dumbing down of
Mm,
men almost. There's actually tons of like studies on this. If we look at like media representations, like Family Guy and The Simpsons,
yeah.
right? There's a lot of like kind of dumb man
Yeah.
stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
But the toxic feminine is really this kind of yeah, this kind of like again, I come back to the princess archetype because if you think about like the princess versus the queen, they're two very different energies, right?
Right.
The princess is very immature. She doesn't manage her own money. She doesn't have her own kind of thing to rule or her own kingdom to rule. Probably doesn't have a job or any kind of meaningful contribution. She's just kind of waiting around. She's kind of
Yeah.
waiting to be chosen. And she's pretty entitled, right? The
Mm,
belief is that someone's going to look after her, like some daddy figure's going to look after her.
mm-hmm.
And again, I mean, the sugar daddy thing is a real thing,
Right.
right? There's tons of that happening without it being overtly like, oh, who's a sugar daddy? It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
no, this dude pays for everything, and you don't do anything back. not saying it has to be financial, but every relationship has to have some kind of balance. There
Right.
has to be some kind of reciprocity. There has to be these two kind of balanced individuals. And when I think of the queen energy, I mean, Alison Armstrong talks a lot about this and the different archetypes that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But like the queen energy, she's like, she has the capability of like ruling, of setting laws, of like managing systems and like managing
Mm-hmm.
finances and like doing speeches and like delivering and serving. And, there's much more kind of like depth to it. And you
Yeah.
can still be a queen. You can still be very feminine. It's just you're very grounded and rooted and responsible,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there's this kind of like maturity that comes with it. But yeah, I mean, there's tons of toxic feminine. When I think about a lot of that kind of like entitlement that we see amongst women, I mean, that is really what it is. Even
Right.
again in like media representations and like in pop music and whatever it might be. But yeah, this kind of like, I mean, I think the whole boss babe archetype is pretty toxic.
Mm.
I think a lot of it is like very infantilizing.
Yeah.
It's this idea of like, why do I have to be a babe?
Right.
Like, right? Why? Like, why? Like, I don't know. There's something a little bit about that's kind of like, why am I still staying in this kind of like, we have to have like a cute little name around it? Why does that have to
Mm-hmm.
be cute?
Right.
Like, why? Why can't I
Yeah.
just be a boss?
A boss. Right.
Right?
No, that's so true. And I like hearing you talk about it with the entitlement and that princess archetype. That makes a lot of sense. And it is interesting though that it's not talked about as much as
Mm.
masculine toxicity.
Yeah.
And I think that more light needs to be brought to it because I think a lot of times like men get such a bad rap. Like there's always women talking about the experience with men who are in their toxic whatever. But it's like women can be just as bad. I'm sure that
Yeah.
there's equally as bad on either side. It's just not talked about, it's not shown. So I think that there's a really warped vision of these energies and where the toxicity lies. I hate
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
thumbs up just showed
I
up.
hate that thing. Yeah,
um,
you're right. And actually, I was going to just quickly say, like,
yeah.
with the older generations, what I see a lot of is again that kind of toxic feminine comes out as like the angry feminine,
Mm,
right? Which again, women have every single right to be angry. I mean, I have tons of anger around various things, and yet when it's only anger and
yeah.
the anger isn't being processed or transmuted or kind of channeled into a healthy outlet and then used productively, because anger can be a very productive emotion. Anger
Yeah.
shows us where our boundaries are, it shows us what we
Yeah.
need. But when it's just like kind of stagnating anger that's then projected and leaking out at the masculine, which again I see a lot of. I have a lot of men who are like in their 50s and 60s who come to me and they tell me how unhappy they are in their marriages and how they kind of feel broken down and they don't really have an identity anymore and they can't
Mm-hmm.
leave and blah 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 blah, and like the wife is so angry and I'm like, I know this is a real thing.
Yeah.
That again is a rendition of like, well, do something about it, right?
Yeah.
Both of you are being unintegrated. You're in your feminine,
Mm-hmm.
you're in your masculine. Like, do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Get back into balance and like start kind of channeling this in a more healthy, productive way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How would you say would be for any women who are listening that might identify a little bit with the princess archetype? What are some actionable things that women could do to move more towards the queen?
Yeah. So I think we first have to recognize that being in the princess archetype, like, it's not the full evolution of who we are. It's kind of like a younger version of us, right? Probably quite a wounded version of us, actually, that is still kind of looking out for mum, dad,
Mm-hmm.
someone to provide and to protect and care for them. And that's fine. We all have our own wounded selves. We know from pretty much every modality of deep therapy out there and deep healing, it really boils down to reparenting yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
so in order to get out of that kind of toxic feminine where you are more prone to codependency, more prone to kind of manipulating other people and projecting yourself on other people because you're operating out of this kind of like wounded childhood, like feminine self, it's all going to be about reparenting yourself. And I think for me, the fastest hack to doing that is simply going to be like, okay, well, let's think. When you are in relationship, what are the tasks and responsibilities that typically the man, your boyfriend, your husband would do.
Mm-hmm.
And those very things, whatever it might be, cooking for me, I don't know, managing holidays, or like providing more income, doing
Yeah.
investments, running me a bath, all of these things, whatever it might be,
Yeah.
start doing them for yourself.
Yeah.
It's really that simple. Start doing it for yourself and treat the whole thing as like a reparenting slash becoming your own boyfriend. But it's
Yeah.
actually like the nicest thing that you can do. Like genuinely, when you start doing, like, this is how one of my clients like ended up moving countries, because she started doing it for herself, and she was like, "Oh, she's like, I've been waiting always for a man to rescue me. I've been always waiting
Yeah.
for someone to provide for me." And she's like, now that I've sat down and I've created this space and container for myself to actually explore, like, what is it that I actually really want and need to be happy and treat myself as a boyfriend would treat me. She's like, well, I would take a sabbatical. I would take a long holiday. And
Yeah.
then that sabbatical turned into like living out there. And she's so much happier. Right. And now, because she's
Yeah.
got her own kind of inner boyfriend, she's not approaching dating and relationships with this kind of like desperate, needy,
Yeah.
like princessy, like save me energy,
Yeah.
because she's kind of covered her own back. Right.
I love that. And I would imagine that builds so much self-confidence too,
Mm-hmm.
and self-respect for that matter. So you're going to be
100%.
creating new boundaries for yourself and making sure that whoever is that right person for you is going to meet those boundaries, understand the respect and all of that that you hold for yourself. And I really like that a lot. That's
Yeah.
awesome. On the
Mm-hmm.
flip side of that, for men that are on the other end of it, maybe they're too in their masculine, what are some things that they could do to start to level things out?
Yeah. So that's going to look like, fastest route, it's going to be tapping into your emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tapping into your emotion. And that might feel too big of a leap, because they might be like, oh, that's really scary. I don't know what's going to happen when I tap into that. Like, oh, it's really whatever. But that's going to use your masculine energy to start creating structure and safety and like containers for that emotion. This is really like why like I love my program so much, because really it's actually a very masculine, safe container. It's got a methodology, it's got
Mm-hmm.
science, it's very rational, it's very logical. There's like a clear structure and outcomes to it. And then within those spaces, there's a lot of room for that kind of more like creative, expressive,
Mm-hmm.
deep emotional work, but it's contained. It's not going to escape everywhere. You're not going to
Yeah.
ruin your life or, get
No.
overwhelmed by it, because it's contained. And so same thing with men. It's like, can you start carving out time for yourself, whether it's on a weekly basis or daily basis? We can start kind of like dipping in and then kind of pulling yourself back out, right? Dipping
Mm-hmm.
into the emotions, so dipping into whatever it is that you're feeling, and then pulling yourself back out. I mean, meditation is like a really great tool for this,
Mm-hmm.
because in meditation, if you start to meditate by kind of going inward into your own emotional expression, you have a container. It's like a 20-minute meditation or a 30-minute
Right.
meditation. You're in one place.
Mm-hmm.
You're not running through the streets crying your eyes out, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
pretty structured and safe. So that's what I would definitely say to recommend it. I mean, this is what I recommend to my clients for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I've got a final couple questions for you.
Mhm.
Starting off with, what summit are you currently chasing?
I am chasing the summit of, what kind of two summits I'm chasing? One is I want to help 400 executives and entrepreneurs by 2030. By 2030, it's like not
I love
rushing
that.
it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of just this goal that I like pulled out, and I was like, I think it's doable. I think it's
Yeah.
doable. That's pretty good impact there. So that's kind of one. And then in terms of like this year, it's really just, yeah, focusing on my group program. I've got the people in there right now who the feedback from them, honestly, like I have to not cry, and telling me
Mm-hmm.
that, like my work, like the program is a godsend to them, that it's a game changer, that it's like transforming their life, that they're getting results, and seeing them actually go out there and find love. Like
Mm-hmm.
that for me is just like my reason for being. So
Yeah.
I want to focus on that and fine tuning that. And I'm adding to it
Mm-hmm.
every single week and like iterating it and making it better. And yeah, and just having more people to serve. That really is the summit.
That's amazing. And then
Mhm.
what is the impact do you want to that you want to have made when you're gone?
To have spread more love in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
Easy
it.
as. I love that.
Mhm.
Where can people find you?
So best place to be is going to be Well, you can find all my details on my website at katarinapolonska.com. You can watch a free training that I have up there. It's an hour-long training on the behavioral science of attraction. So everything I walk through in my methodology, you can watch that there. And there you can also get links to my LinkedIn. I hang out there a lot. It's Katarina Polonski on LinkedIn, or my Instagram at Katarina Polonska. Pretty easy name. Like, there's not many people called me out there. But yeah, they're the best ways.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Katarina. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. And best of luck with everything.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode of Voices of Impact. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you found value in our conversation, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more inspiring stories and actionable advice, make sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Also, we would love to hear your thoughts and takeaways, so please leave us a comment below. And remember, no matter where you are on your journey, you have the power to climb higher and chase your summit. Until next time, Summit Chasers, keep pushing forward and stay inspired.